and you fill up exactly 2 tanks of gas. But you look at the meter on the pump, and it essentially forces you to pay the price for nearly 3.
Right, which is just a brutal feeling.
It really is. I mean, you don't get a third tank. You don't get, like, premium fuel or a free car wash. You just forfeit that extra money into the ether before you are allowed to drive away.
Yeah, it just vanishes.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, this isn't some hypothetical thought experiment. When you look at the latest U.S. inflation data for March 2026, specifically the 44.2% spike in fuel oil and the nearly 19% jump in gasoline, that is the literal mathematical reality hitting wallets across the country right now.
It really is. It's hitting everybody.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are tearing into this March inflation report. We want to find out why the economic finish line just got, completely moved further away from you. We'll look at why the cost of your daily existence is suddenly spiking again, and why the hidden numbers buried beneath the headlines actually suggest a totally different, highly targeted story.
Right, because before we get into the weeds, we should probably just establish what we mean by inflation here, based on the data, because it gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, please give us the jargon-free version.
Basically, it's just the speed at which prices are rising for everyday necessities, your food, fuel, rent, transport. And the underlying narrative in this new March data is a massive reversal of expectations regarding that speed.
A reversal. Because things were actually looking pretty good for a minute there, right?
They really were. For the first 2 months of 2026, the overarching sentiment in the markets, and honestly among consumers, was that the fever had finally broken.
Yeah, we were looking at a year-over-year headline inflation rate of 2.4% in January and February.
Exactly. And 2.4% is within striking distance of the central bank's ultimate 2% target. So the assumption was that all the macroeconomic tightening had done its job. We were, gliding right into a soft landing.
But then March happened.
Yeah. Then we get this March print of 3.3% year over year, and it shatters that illusion entirely.
It really does. I mean, it is the economic equivalent of driving a car with a leaky tire.
Yeah.
For months, you've been carefully patching this slow leak, watching the pressure gauge stabilize. And right when you finally get comfortable enough to merge back onto the highway, you hear a massive hiss.
Oh, man, yeah.
And the steering wheel just violently pulls to the right. You thought the problem was completely solved, but suddenly you are forced to change your driving behavior all over again just to keep the car on the road.
That's a perfect way to describe it, because we went from a highly controlled 2.4% environment straight back to 3.3.
Which is a fundamental, abrupt shift.
It is. And honestly, the psychological toll of that specific shift just cannot be overstated, because economics is driven by consumer behavior and forward-looking expectations just as much as it is driven by raw capital.
Right. It's about how people feel.
Exactly. When an economy sustains a cooling trend for consecutive months, like we saw leading up to March, households actually recalibrate their internal baselines. They move out of a defensive financial posture.
Meaning they start spending normally again.
Right. They start planning capital expenditures again, whether that means replacing a failing refrigerator or, approving a family vacation, or honestly just feeling less baseline anxiety when walking down the grocery aisle. The pressure valve releases.
But then the 3.3% print hits.
And the pressure valve slams entirely shut instantly.
Because everyone just panics.
Basically, yeah. When the trajectory reverses upward after a period of sustained relief, it triggers a disproportionately defensive reaction from consumers. People realize they're going to have to allocate a larger percentage of their stagnant income just to maintain their current standard of living.
So they just stop spending on fun stuff.
Exactly. It forces a rapid contraction in discretionary spending. People stop thinking about getting ahead and immediately revert to survival mode. They're simply trying to tread water, and the prevailing sentiment shifts from optimism to profound uncertainty.
And that uncertainty is completely justified when we look beneath that annual 3.3% figure and examine the short-term volatility.
Oh, absolutely. The year-over-year number gives us the macro trend, but the month-over-month data reveals the immediate acute trauma to the system.
Yeah, let's talk about that month-over-month data.
Yeah.
Because from February to March, so in a single 30-day window, prices surged by 0.9%.
Which is huge.
It is. It's the highest monthly increase we have seen since June 2022.
Yeah, a 0.9% jump in 30 days is a violent macroeconomic movement. It places this current economic environment right back into the framework of the peak inflationary shocks we navigated a few years ago.
It totally breaks the narrative of a gradual stabilization.
Wow.
But, I want to push back on this just a little bit.
Sure, go for it.
Because a 0.9% monthly jump doesn't look like much to a layman reading a headline.
Right.
Like if an apple costs $1, 0.9% is not even a single penny.
Right. Visually, it looks tiny.
Exactly. So why is a 0.9% jump in a single month a massive red flag? Why are central banks freaking out over less than a penny on the dollar?
Well, the trap of looking at a monthly percentage in a vacuum is one of the most dangerous optical illusions in economics. You have to treat monthly inflation exactly like compounding interest on a high-yield debt.
Okay, so it builds on itself.
Exactly. That 0.9% increase isn't a static one-time addition that gets spread out evenly over the year. If the economy sustains a 0.9% price increase every single month, each subsequent jump is applied to the newly inflated baseline from the previous month.
Ah, so the growth spirals exponentially.
It does. If you compound 0.9% over 12 consecutive months, you don't end up with an annual inflation rate of 3.3%.
You end up way higher.
Way higher. You are staring down the barrel of an annualized rate exceeding 11%.
Wow. Wait, really? 11%?
Yeah, mathematically, that's where a sustained run rate like that takes you. And that annualized trajectory is exactly why policymakers are sweating right now. A sustained 11% run rate would completely destabilize domestic purchasing power.
Now, obviously, we are not projecting that this 0.9% print will necessarily repeat for 12 consecutive months.
No, not at all. But the sheer velocity of that single month jump tells us something really important. It tells us that this is not a slow structural warming of the broader economy. It is an acute, localized shock.
It means something broke.
Exactly. It tells us that something massive broke or shifted violently within the global supply chain between February and March.
Which forces us to isolate the variable. What specific mechanism broke in those 30 days to cause such a severe jolt?
And the data points directly to one thing.
Right. When we strip away all the other sectors, it all points to a single monolithic engine driving this sudden spike, and that is the energy sector.
The energy sector, yeah.
Overall energy prices surged by 12.5%. But when you dissect that aggregate number, the localized spikes are just staggering. Gasoline jumped 18.9%, and fuel oil skyrocketed by an anomalous 44.2%.
And we really have to categorize a 44.2% spike in an essential commodity as a market crisis, because energy demand is highly inelastic.
I mean, you can't just choose not to buy it.
Exactly. Unlike discretionary purchases, where a consumer can simply choose to delay buying a new television or going out to a restaurant if prices rise, you cannot easily opt out of energy consumption. You are fundamentally required to heat your home during the winter.
Right, you can't just freeze.
Right. And you are required to put fuel in your vehicle to commute to your place of employment.
The consumption is mandatory, which means the price increase acts as a direct, unavoidable tax on household liquidity. It instantly cannibalizes the money that would otherwise be spent in the broader economy.
It really does.
Yeah.
So we have to look at the catalyst. Why did this happen?
Yes, and we need to draw a very strict parameter around this discussion for you listening right now. The source material cites the primary driver for this severe global energy crunch as the war with Iran. And we are examining this conflict solely through the lens of a mechanical supply chain disruptor. We are not making any political statements here. We are looking strictly at how geopolitical instability in a major oil-producing and transit-heavy region directly chokes the global oil supply, which mathematically alters the spot price of crude.
Right. From a purely logistical standpoint, the global petroleum market operates on an incredibly delicate equilibrium of supply and demand. It is heavily reliant on the unimpeded flow of tankers through specific, narrow maritime choke points.
And oil is a fungible global commodity.
Exactly. If the flow of crude is threatened anywhere on the planet, the spot price everywhere on the planet reacts instantaneously.
Because the market price is in the risk before the physical shortage even hits the refineries, right?
Absolutely. When conflict erupts in a critical region, the immediate disruption to extraction and refinement is really only the first layer of the problem.
What's the second layer?
The secondary and honestly often more severe disruption is maritime logistics. Commercial shipping fleets are forced to rapidly reroute their tankers to avoid active conflict zones.
Which takes time and fuel.
A lot of time. It adds thousands of nautical miles and weeks of transit time to the journey. Furthermore, the maritime insurance premiums for vessels operating anywhere near the region skyrocket astronomically.
So the aggregate supply of accessible crude oil effectively shrinks, while the global demand for refined petroleum products remains entirely static.
And the math there is unforgiving. When supply drops and demand holds firm, the price clears at a much higher premium.
So that geopolitical friction, thousands of miles away, is the direct mechanical cause of the 44.2% spike in fuel oil and the 18.9% jump in gasoline you're experiencing domestically.
Exactly. The global supply crunch is simply passing the geopolitical risk premium directly down to the local consumer.
But, I think the danger of analyzing this purely as an quote-unquote energy crisis is that it creates a false sense of security for people who aren't directly purchasing those specific fuels.
Oh, for sure.
Because you might be listening to this thinking, well, I live in a major metropolitan area, I take the subway, I don't own a car, and my building uses electric heating. So this 44% spike in fuel oil is unfortunate for drivers, but it doesn't really impact my daily overhead.
Right, which is a very dangerous misconception.
Because energy inflation doesn't stay confined to the gas pump. It operates as an invisible compounding tax on absolutely everything you buy. Let's trace the ripple effect of how an isolated fuel shock aggressively infects the broader economy.
The concept of the invisible shipping fee is paramount here. Every physical object in your immediate vicinity right now, the device you are listening to this on, the furniture in your room, the food in your refrigerator,
All of it.
every single bit of it required a massive expenditure of refined petroleum to get from its raw material state into your hands.
Let's follow the logistics of a single basic commodity to illustrate the true scale of this energy exposure. Let's take a standard cotton t-shirt.
A standard cotton t-shirt is a perfect encapsulation of globalized supply chains. So the journey begins in an agricultural field where massive industrial harvesters, which run on diesel fuel, extract the raw cotton.
Okay, so step one is already using expensive diesel.
Right. Then that raw material is loaded onto commercial freight trucks or diesel-electric locomotives to be transported to a textile manufacturing facility.
So that is just the domestic agricultural leg, and we've already burned significant diesel, the price of which is obviously surging.
Exactly. From there, the manufacturing plant spins, dyes, and weaves that cotton into a garment. These industrial facilities operate on immense amounts of electricity.
And as the data shows, the broader energy sector, which includes electrical generation that relies heavily on natural gas and coal, that jumped 12.5%.
Yep, so the physical production of the shirt just became significantly more expensive.
Okay, what happens next? The shirt is made.
Then the finished t-shirt is packed into a massive shipping container and loaded onto a commercial cargo vessel.
A vessel that burns thousands of gallons of bunker fuel, right?
Exactly. Bunker fuel is a heavy, unrefined fuel oil. They burn that every single day as they cross the ocean. And as global crude supplies tighten, the cost of that bunker fuel skyrockets.
So the ship gets to the U.S. port.
Once the vessel arrives at a domestic port, it is unloaded by massive, energy-intensive gantry cranes. Then the container is secured to a Class 8 heavy-duty semi-truck.
Which burns diesel.
Lots of diesel. That truck hauls it to a regional distribution warehouse. That warehouse requires constant electricity for lighting, automation, and climate control.
And finally, a last-mile delivery van running on standard gasoline, which we know is up 18.9%,
Right.
drives that t-shirt from the distribution center directly to your front door.
Every single node in that supply chain is inextricably linked to the price of energy. When the cost of extraction, refinement, maritime transport, electrical generation, and last-mile delivery all spike simultaneously, the aggregate cost to move that t-shirt from the field to your hands increases drastically.
And the retail corporation selling that t-shirt operates on fixed profit margins. They are not going to just absorb a 40% increase in their logistics overhead out of the goodness of their hearts.
No, absolutely not.
They're going to pass every single cent of that invisible shipping fee directly down to you by raising the retail price of the shirt.
Which is why a targeted spike in global fuel essentially operates as a universal consumption tax. It forces businesses across every sector of the economy to rewrite their pricing strategies just to protect their margins against surging logistical costs.
So, if we stop the analysis right there, the picture looks incredibly grim. We have a massive year-over-year reversal, terrifying month-over-month compounding potential, a 44% localized spike in fuel oil, and a universal logistics tax bleeding into retail prices.
It sounds like the sky is falling.
It does. It would be entirely logical for a listener to assume that the underlying foundation of the U.S. economy is structurally failing.
Right.
But when we actually unmask the broader data and separate the external shocks from the internal metrics, the numbers reveal a completely different reality. There are actually bright spots.
This brings us to the critical distinction between headline inflation and core inflation. To truly diagnose the structural health of a domestic economy, monetary policymakers utilize core inflation.
And core inflation deliberately strips out the hypervolatile food and energy sectors, right?
Exactly. It removes them from the equation entirely.
And according to the March data, while headline inflation surged to 3.3%, core inflation remained highly suppressed at just 2.6%.
Right, and a core inflation rate of 2.6% indicates that the underlying macroeconomic vitals of the United States are actually quite stable. It suggests that if you remove the geopolitical friction currently choking the global oil supply, the internal domestic economy is functioning relatively close to the desired equilibrium.
But, we always hear the critique that stripping out food and energy is inherently tone-deaf to the working class. It is probably the most common pushback economists face.
Oh, for sure. People hate it.
Because a consumer looks at that metric and says, look, you are artificially lowering the inflation rate by ignoring the only two things I literally cannot survive without buying every single week. Isn't it a bit insulting to the average person to say, well, inflation isn't too high if you just ignore the stuff that's currently bankrupting them?
That frustration is entirely valid. And the optics of ignoring food and energy are undeniably terrible for the average household experiencing that acute financial pain. However, the Federal Reserve does not separate core inflation to dismiss the lived reality of the consumer.
Then why do they do it?
They separate it to determine the correct macroeconomic medicine required to stabilize the system.
Because monetary policy is a blunt instrument.
Exactly. You have to know what kind of inflation you are fighting. Central banks control inflation primarily by manipulating the federal funds rate. If core inflation is running incredibly hot, meaning the price of housing, medical care, used cars, electronics, and domestic services are all surging simultaneously, it signals that the economy is structurally overheating.
Meaning there's too much money chasing too few goods across the board.
Right. And in that scenario, the central bank must aggressively raise interest rates to destroy demand, making it more expensive for businesses to borrow and consumers to spend.
But the Federal Reserve cannot print barrels of crude oil.
Precisely. You cannot solve a global petroleum shortage caused by a geopolitical conflict by raising domestic mortgage rates.
Right.
If the central bank looks at a massive energy spike and reacts by violently hiking interest rates to crush demand, they risk throwing a fundamentally healthy domestic economy into a severe, unnecessary recession.
Without actually solving the underlying supply chain issue driving the inflation in the first place.
Exactly. By isolating core inflation at 2.6%, policymakers can confirm that the internal economic engine is not overheating. The aggressive inflation we are seeing is an exogenous supply shock, not an endogenous structural failure.
It is the difference between a patient suffering from a severe, acute allergic reaction to a bee sting versus a patient suffering from a chronic systemic autoimmune disease.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Because the bee sting, which is the 44% spike in fuel oil, is agonizing. It causes immediate visible swelling and requires acute management. But when the doctors check the patient's vitals, the core inflation, the resting heart rate and blood pressure are totally normal.
Right. The underlying system is healthy. It is just reacting to a violent external stimulus.
And the data actually supports that analogy perfectly, because when we look at the sectors making up that core 2.6% figure, we are actually seeing significant deflationary trends and stabilization in major categories.
We really are. The used automotive market, for example, which was a primary driver of inflation over the past few years, actually contracted by 3.2% in March.
So used car prices actually went down.
Yes. The supply chains for microchips and automotive parts have largely normalized, allowing vehicle depreciation to finally resume its natural historical trajectory.
Furthermore, despite the immense upward pressure from those logistical shipping fees we discussed earlier, food inflation actually decelerated from 3.1% to 2.7%.
Which is pretty incredible. It's a testament to how rapidly agricultural supply chains have adapted to efficiency models. They are protecting consumer pricing by absorbing the energy shock internally rather than passing it all through immediately.
And perhaps most critically, the shelter index, so housing and rent, which constitutes the largest single weighting in the average consumer's basket of goods.
Right, the biggest expense.
That remained remarkably stable at an annualized 3%.